Yvette, my dear friend.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here with me.
Happy to be here.
I want to give our listeners a background of who you are. So Yvette Romero Coronado is the granddaughter and daughter of Mexican migrants, farm workers, dreamers, home remedy makers, and people who talk to their plants. You draw on the wisdom of your ancestors to become a good ancestor. I love that. I love that. And to be a loving and responsible guest on the enduring lands of the Eastern Shoshone, Goshu, Paiute, and Ute peoples. You love tea, the good chisme type of tea. We call it, in Hindi, we call it gupshup.
Gupshup for me.
Gupshup,
all day.
Chisme, you and me both, all day.
Yes.
And you enjoy your time in nature. You are a bilingual and multicultural licensed clinical social worker. Mm-hmm. For over 15 years, you have worked alongside communities to build systems and programs that prioritizes access, belonging, equity, and well-being. And today in this episode, we're going to explore the importance of centering healing in the pursuit of social change, rediscovering our true selves, because you and I had this amazing, beautiful conversation just a few weeks ago about getting back to our true selves and reclaiming our humanity in spaces and conversation that often fail to recognize it. So then well, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So happy you're here. You've been a dear friend. I know. You've been a dear friend to me and my family for a long time. My sister knows you. My brother knows you. I mean, we've been orbiting around each other for some time. Around each other, but we actually haven't been able to sit down and have this kind of a conversation, or even just face-to-face conversation. Yeah. So I'm just so happy that we get to share this space together.
Same.
So then, can you start off by telling me about your own healing journey and how it's unfolded and how you might have changed over the past few years?
Yeah. So I keep thinking about the different stages of healing and different developmentally what each of those parts of me would say I was doing. And I was thinking, I was like, what would high school, Yvette, early college, undergrad, first generation student say? And I think in that moment, right, it's like growing up in Utah, I went to Westlake, I went to Granger, which were some of the more diverse places or schools in the state, but still were, majority white. And as an English language learning student, that very much colored my experience in school. And so going from Westlake and Granger to the University of Utah, where there were even fewer students of color, right? It's like, and so few from Granger, because we've always had a reputation, it seems like. Stop the rumors, y'all. But people used to say terrible things.
Yeah, I'm from Davis County, and there's definitely like these perceptions around Granger, West High, like all of these different.
See, you heard and you were over there.
Yeah, I was there, and I was over there.
So I think going from Granger to the university, my healing started with finding Mecha, the Chicana Chicano Student Association, or Movimiento Estudiantil Chicana Chicano de Aztlán. That was a place where I was finding people who reflected back parts of my identity, language, and were giving me language to understand what I had been experiencing and couldn't quite articulate around internalized racism, around oppression, and family dynamics that come from, income disparities and things of that nature. And so I think finding that place, having healing for me looked like engaging in activism, learning how to talk about what I had experienced and then doing something about it. And that was a really important moment in the healing journey. And then I would say probably after that, going on to grad school and becoming a social worker in training and getting that new lens around like, oh, okay, there's the micro, meso, macro ways of looking at change and looking at healing and being mad stressed because I was working 3 jobs. Right? It's like healing in that moment looked like surviving grad school, trying to figure out how to take in all the information do a good job at my practicums and try to digest all of that. But then it also was really interesting, right? It's like I was having these experiences of going back home and saying things to my parents like, I'm never going to celebrate Thanksgiving again. And they'd be like, okay, see yourself wherever you want to go. We're going to continue to have our family dinner. That's not what this is about. But I started protesting a bunch of different things around my house. So it was interesting because as I think about my healing around like probably my early to mid 20s, it started to look like creating maybe some distance from the things that I had grown up in. And that's what I was thinking I had to do. Right? I was like, I'm identifying separately from my family. I am this person, totally noticing how I was taking on a very individualistic way of thinking about what I had to do to heal and what I had to do to overcome the circumstances that I had grown up in, right? It's like not even knowing necessarily how I was inadvertently participating in just white supremacist culture. Yeah. Right? It's like all of a sudden I was like, here I am. Yes, I'm going to be the first person in my family to go to grad school. I'm going to break generational barriers of poverty. I'm going to break generational barriers of XYZ traumas. But it started to look like that, where I was like pulling away, and probably in some cases, just circumstance, right? Like who has time to do all the things plus go to grad school and work? Ain't nobody got time. So I think circumstances were sort of pulling me away from all of that. And I was learning this whole new way of thinking that definitely centered individualism, centered healing through the Western perspective. And I was eating it up, just eating it up. And so that's what I thought I had to do to heal. And, you know, from there to here, it's a leap. But from there to here, I would say starting to work in community, working with survivors of sexual violence, working with youth in the juvenile justice services, working with adults in criminal justice services, working with youth through like a youth development approach, and doing child welfare work. Just like, I think my perspective started to expand about, okay, well, what does it actually look like on the ground for people to do it in a way that works for them? And curiously, what that did is that I started to make my way back home in the sense that I started to remember or reconnect with the things that my grandma would say, with the things that my aunties and uncles and my mom or my dad would say. They were starting to ring more so in my mind and just like in every other part of me as like things that felt cozy, things that felt meaningful and medicinal. And that's sort of where I've landed, and the place that I've continued to cultivate what the healing journey has looked like, because it's felt like when I started to make my way back home into the things that I knew and my family knew, I started to find myself and I started to understand the importance of carrying my ancestors with me through the process, and recognizing also, right, is like there are parts of my ancestors that that are harm, and there are parts of my ancestors that are medicine. Yeah. And so how do I navigate those pieces and bring them forward in a way that for me is now looking like two things, right? It's like, one, what does it look like to repair harm? And then the other, what does it look like to reclaim the pieces that have been lost, marginalized, tried to be erased by society? How do I reclaim those pieces to keep me grounded? And how do I work on the stuff that needs to be repaired? And that's where I'm at now, and don't have all the answers. But this is how I think about my healing journey now, is like the places and the things that must be repaired, and the things and the places where I need to cultivate, like, and reclaim parts of them, parts of me, etc.
I mean, that resonates so much, because when you get into activism work and your whole thing is about, I need to, defy systems that were working against me. And it does start off pretty individual. Even though you learn about it as a collective, it starts off as pretty individual, and you get this fire in you. It's a bit of an anger, it's a bit of sadness, but it's mostly anger and just sort of like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to be the one. And then to evolve into, yes, and there are beautiful parts of me that I don't have to defy, because that actually informs this bigger healing. I love that. And I love the two parts that you were talking about. The one that needs to be repaired or changed, and then the parts that need to be reclaimed. I remember you telling me this, and then I was thinking, how do they work together? How do they, or are they very separate?
Yeah. I think most of the time they work together, and sometimes they feel separate. But I like what you said, and I try to live in that space of the and. Like, yes, and. These feel like polars, like polarities. And what's the bridge? Right? Yeah. It's like, how do I connect these two parts? I think in terms of the repair and what I think is absolutely necessary is thinking about, right? It's like my ancestors were deeply affected by colonization on both sides. And so how can I, as someone who is the descendant of settlers from Spain, also be thinking about undoing those systems that harmed my indigenous ancestors, and what does that look like in my day-to-day actions? And so examples might be, right, is like at least on the reclaiming side of things, is thinking about the traditional medicine practices of my grandmother and probably the people before her. I don't know who taught her. I didn't get the privilege of asking her that. But thinking about reclaiming those things and building an altar or like an ofrenda in my home and keeping it, and keeping all four elements, right? Water, earth, wind, fire, always there. And visiting it every morning, and being in dialogue and in communion with those folks and asking them for guidance. And that's what I did this morning. I was just like, help me say the things that need to be said, that are going to be most authentic, that are going to be most helpful. And so there's that piece around the reclamation, and that's a deeply personal practice. And when I think about repair, I think about it at a couple different levels. And this is probably my social worker brain now, is that at the micro level, it looks like having difficult conversations with my family members sometimes around like, let's stop only giving compliments to the little light-skinned babies in our family. Let's stop giving these nicknames that are not so kind to the darker-skinned people in our family. Like, why are we doing that? Like, that's not necessary.
Yeah.
It's like, it looks like challenging some of those things that are cultural norms, and people more often than not are like, we're not saying it in a mean-spirited way. And I say, I understand that. And think about what it feels like on the receiving end, and to have been receiving it for a really long time, and to then be receiving it also from outside this family, what that's going to feel like. So I think at the micro level, it looks like having those conversations, because so much of what we've internalized from colonization is just now culture.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, I don't know if you've read My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. He has this gorgeous quote that I think really highlights this. He says, trauma decontextualized over time looks like personality.
Oh, wow.
Trauma decontextualized over time looks like culture.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets really tricky and it's really important to discern like which parts of my ancestral inheritance may be medicinal, and which parts may actually need to be parted ways with because they're a product of harm and colonization. And right, it's like there are things that, right, it's like I hold my grandmother in very high regard, and she's someone who was my caregiver. I know for a fact that there are perspectives that she and I would differ on different political topics, and that she would move in ways that are very different than I would move. And I have to try to understand, not place judgment on what she would do or what I think she would do, and also say, I know that she would do that because she would be really worried about being marginalized in the small community that she lived in. And I understand that, and I see that for her, but I don't have to be a people pleaser now.
Yeah.
Because my circumstances are different, right? It's like, I'm not the first person in my family to migrate here. I was born here. Yeah. She had to be the perfect immigrant so that people didn't think that she was XYZ, right? Undeserving of being here, or whatever standard people had for and still continue to have for immigrants. Right? It's like, I think some of the people pleasing, some of the sort of the ways that the decisions that she was making had to do with survival, right? Those were her survival instincts. Those were her survival tools at the time. And I don't have to continue them. And so there are things about also having some discernment with carrying forward the inheritances and asking yourself, did this come from a place of abundance and a place of groundedness, or did this come from survivalism? And is this still serving us today? I genuinely don't think my grandma would have wanted me to live the same life she lived. She came here for that reason. She wanted us to have a very different lifestyle. So I'm like, what does that actually look like then? If I honor that hope that she had, what does it look like then to actually be able to move beyond what she was able to experience? So it's like, there's the repair with my family, and then thinking about repair at the community and at the larger meso system. It looks like advocacy. It looks like recognizing that, I grew up in Utah, so your girl can speak and can, what is called code switch, right? I know what it's like to visit with my people on the West Side, and I know what it's like to be on the university campus and talk to my dean and talk to other people who are in positions of power, and being able to code switch and leverage the education, my thinking skills to then be able to bring people into a conversation and say, okay, we're seeing that there's a gap in serving our Spanish-speaking members in the community. What are we going to do? How are we going to do that in a way that is actually centering the ways that they think about healing, the people who they lean on for healing, right? Who are traditional medicine. In some cases, are traditional medicine folks still who live in West Valley and who, probably everywhere. How do we invite those people in? How do we bring them into the classroom, acknowledge them as knowledge producers, as people who are very essential to this conversation? And so it starts to look like pushing systems to include people who have knowledge that I may have only a tiny bit about, and seeing them and valuing them and bringing them into the decision-making process. So those are just like some maybe ways that I think about repair, is like changing systems so that they actually stop harming people and they stop reproducing systems of oppression like white supremacy. I would not want Spanish-speaking mental health providers to go back into community and reproduce perspectives around what well-being looks like that have, for example, that center individualism. Yeah. In family dynamics, I'm not going to tell my client, well, you just disagreed with your mom. You don't have to talk to your mom ever again. Yeah. You don't have to be in that toxic relationship. That's an individualistic way of looking at well-being and at problem solving, and that's harmful. Yeah. So anyway, my hope is to support people who are doing the work, to understand that there are collectivistic ways of being, that there are other knowledge systems around healing and medicine, so that we can help them reconnect with that and they can free themselves. We're not there to save anybody. We're not there to heal anybody. We're there to just offer a space where people can start digging into that for themselves. So that's what repair looks like for me too, as someone who is in a teaching position, as someone who has influence in how programs get developed, is like bringing in new conversations and challenging people to think about well-being and mental health in much more expansive ways, so that, it just works for people.
Yeah. So many things you said. So many things you said that stood out, but even just more recently, what you just talked about, even this idea of like boundaries and cutting family members off, and it's different. I mean, it's not how we grew up. We don't cut people out. We just don't. That's not in our, and some would say, oh, well, that's just codependency and that's just trauma bonding and that's, you know, all these terms. But like, no, actually deeper than that, culturally, we're not brought up to just leave a person behind, especially someone who is in the same blood as you, like the same bloodline. That's a little bit more of a complicated thing to do. And so there's just a lot of conversations around how, and I've been told several times, oh, you need to have stronger boundaries or you need to stand up for yourself. And I think that just looks different. Culturally, it looks different. And so I love what you're saying, that you're tuning into that those things may be different, and to not have this one size fits all approach. And just being culturally aware of how people navigate relationships, and also holding it as a bigger, wider collective that's not just you and yourself in this planet. We all believe that we're the center of the universe, but really, truly, that's obviously not the case. But I think that your approach is so beautiful. When you're in these spaces and you're talking to influential people who are making policies and who are making systemic change for good or for worse, how make it make sense? How do you make it make sense to me? How do you connect with those who honestly don't really care? I mean, do they care? I don't know. So you tell me, how do you navigate those conversations? Because I feel like you come at it in a very like, okay, let's eye to eye. Let's find out what our values are. Let's find out where we can like really meet in the middle here. But if they don't, and if truly they are embedded in, you know, white supremacy culture, where this is just, that's the right way, how do you change those minds?
Yeah. I don't think that's my lane.
That's not your lane.
I don't think my lane is being in spaces with people who don't see everyone's humanity. I think there are people who I choose not to expend energy and time dialoguing with or talking at or being talked at, because I don't think it's productive, and I don't think it's a place where I can actually be helpful. In fact, I'm probably more triggered than I am helpful. And at that point, I'm not choosing my words well, and I'm probably not going to be very kind. And then I lose sense of my humanity and theirs, and then it's a shit show. So I don't think that's my lane. I think my lane, and I think it's very much this is a lane that I get to be in because of my identities, because of how I present in the world, because of my education, and because of my like professional experience. I choose to be in hard spaces with people who can agree that there is a problem, and say, okay, what are we going to do about it? Right? It's like I think being able to say, okay, who was I having a conversation with more recently? Some things are going to get edited out, right? Everything is going to be in? Okay, then I'm going to watch myself. So
I mean, just say it.
No, I don't think that is ready to be aired out. But being able to say, okay, maybe you don't agree with how we got here. But the truth is that at the end of the day, we have, let's say, the social workforce is at a deficit, right? It's like we need more mental health professionals. We don't have enough, blah, blah, blah. Okay, great. So that is an issue. And we have students or people in the state that are wanting to leave because they feel, especially students of color and trans students who have spoken with me and said, I'm going to leave the state as soon as I graduate. I'm trying to figure out which place is going to be friendlier to me, which place is going to be more supportive, it's going to feel cozier. And we're losing those critical folks that we need in our workforce that are already so few. of in our community, and rightfully so. They're asking themselves, is this a place I see myself in? And if the answer is no, they're going to find a place that's cozier. And I don't cast any shade on that.
No.
So when I'm talking to folks who, especially around what's happening after HB 261, is like, we're losing critical workforce. We know the data is clear that we need a workforce that mirrors the identities and the values of the people that they serve. Let's look at let's look at the demographics here in Salt Lake City. The demographics of our providers do not mirror the demographics that we are serving. So when the data tells us that we need to have a match and we don't have a match, what are we going to do? What is it that we're going to do to help those students of color, those trans students, those LGBTQIA folks, Two-Spirit folks feel like they can stay here and they will be seen and they will be supported, and professionally they will be respected? I can get to that place, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I have lots of feelings and thoughts about like how it is that we got here, and we probably would disagree. And people would say, we think HB 261 was necessary, or people would say, we think HB 261 is not necessary. I'm like, it's passed at this point. Here's what's happening.
And HB 261 is a bill that was passed here locally in Utah that basically banned anything diversity, equity, inclusion related. That's
offices, specifically
offices.
Funding for offices that were called or doing equity, diversity, and inclusion work, so jobs attached to that, hiring practices that somehow indicated that they would want somebody who had an equity, like EDI lens, things of that nature. And so, it's like, so I think I can come at those conversations in a very pragmatic way, probably because my mama raised me this way. I'm a Taurus, and I can be very practical.
a Taurus.
I'm a Taurus. So I can be also very pragmatic in that way and say, so what are we going to do? Yeah. What is it that you think we need to do to ensure that our workforce pipeline remains healthy, is open to people that we need in the workforce? And I mean, what's somebody going to say to that, right? It's like, oh, hopefully, I mean, if they're reasonable people who genuinely care about delivering appropriate care and efficacious care, then they're going to say, we need to think about that. Or what is it going to look like now that we can't have EDI offices? And yes, we want those people to stay. So how do we make them stay? So I think I can stay, I can be I'm very intentional sometimes in focusing on, here's what it is. Here's the data. What are we going to do about that? Okay, you don't want to label it as like a function of oppression. You don't want to label it as a function of supremacy. You don't want to label it as any of those things. If we take all that stuff out, you still have this data. So what are you going to say about that?
Right, there's still this disparity. How are you going to address it?
There's still this disparity. So what are you going to do?
Right.
Right. It's like there are 32,000 migrant children that are missing. What are we gonna do? About that? Yeah, it's like, right. Sure, we can have a conversation about how it is that those little humans got here, but these people are missing. So what are we gonna do?
Yeah.
So I think that's a very intentional way that I navigate, and again, code switching, right? It's like I think I've refined that skill, and part of what I also want to highlight here is that the reason why I feel like I can also shift into that is because I have a very robust place where I can pull back from that, settle in, let my hair down, get a little bit more like casual. I have that community that I can fall back to and with, that helps me feel grounded, that pours into my cup, that I can pour into other people's cup. And when and then I have all the other people that I'm leaning on, ancestrally speaking, that I'm like, I lean back into that. I lick my wounds if I need to. I heal them with myself. I take some tea. I'm giving myself limpias or cleansings. Yep. And then I'm like, okay, if I need to take a beat, I take a beat. And then I got to do it again, because I'm that person who lives in the place of like, do something, anything, something. I don't live well in the place of despair. And I feel like that is the place where this system wants to push people into. Yep. And that's part of how I maintain my own humanity and my own sense of self, is like I refuse to be pushed into that place. And so I find every opportunity and way to try to reclaim who I am and myself. And like we were saying the other day too, is it's like when I have that conversation, maybe that person didn't hear me out. Maybe that person was just gave me, talking time, didn't actually think about what I was saying. But at the end of the day, it's like they took nothing away from me, because I had that conversation, and I'm going to go back home, and I'm going to go back to my community and receive the validation, the support, and be supported in my resilience to then get back up and do it again. That person took nothing away from me because I have cultivated this sense of self. I think when I have felt most defeated is when I have bought into a system. And I remember feeling this way when I was an undergraduate and sometimes in grad school, is like I was doing everything the way I thought I was supposed to be doing, and I still wasn't being heard. And that felt like shit. Because it's like, here I am, not going home for the holidays, not doing all these other things because I'm investing in this system that's telling me that if I do that, I'm going to be effective at advocating and at changing the world, and ain't shit happening anyway. And all of a sudden, I haven't seen my family for 5 weeks. I haven't done any self-care. I haven't gone dancing. I haven't been to a carne asada with any of my homies for months, right? It's like, so I've lost that connection to the things that help me feel like retain my personhood and my sovereignty, and got nothing out of it. That place sucks. And I've been there, and that's the place that I think I grew a lot from, and I learned a lot about myself, and then that pushed me to this other place now where I'm like, that's not all of who I am. Like I have this reclamation, and I cultivate it, and I do it in community, so that I can do some of these other harder things around repair, because repair work is hard. Yeah. At the individual level, right? It's like when we fuck it up with a relationship, it's really hard to be humble and to apologize, and then to go through the proper steps to be accountable, to change your ways. That's really hard. And that's what's needed. And I think that that's what's needed in this moment is to really figure out where do we have to anchor into so that we can bolster our resilience to actually do the hard things, the repair of relationships, the repair of systems, because that's going to take us a long time.
I mean, just even you talking about filling your cup and then showing up for everyone. And I think that it sounds wonderful, but I think it sounds new to a lot of people, because then when you were undergrad and you were fighting the fight, and you were also internalizing, I'm sure, everything that was coming to you, and creating this other identity of yourself, even in this space. You don't even know what it feels like to fill your cup. You don't know what it feels like. You just run on empty all the time. And I think people believe even social justice work is running on empty. If I'm not running on empty, then I'm not making impact. Right. And what you're saying is that there's no way you can make impact unless you fill your cup, you ground yourself with community or your ancestors or just something that will let your hair down, that you can fall back on when this work is happening, and then going back and discerning. I love what you said too, that those are not my people. These are not the people, like the places that I choose to be in. That you have a great level of discernment on what conversations you're going to engage in and what conversations you're able to kind of be, keep your own sovereignty, like you said. Probably in this most recent, I think I know that conversation, but in the most recent conversations, because you said to me, they don't take anything from me. And that's so different, because because I put myself in the same shoes as you in undergrad. I remember that I just remember it.
We were there together.
I remember it. And, I always felt something was being taken away all the time. And I was giving it too. I was giving it because I felt like you said, you just kind of have to fit this mold in order to fight. And you're just giving. And then just this idea that they are not taking anything from me because I have my stuff. Like I have my community that I get to go back to. Whether this makes a change or not, I'm still making change. I'm still doing other things. This is not the one and done. This is not the one conversation that's going to make it all change. It's one of many.
Yeah.
Maybe it is just the one with that person. Up to you.
Maybe. Up to that person too.
Up to that person, yeah. So and you were saying that you don't want to sit in disparity, you don't want to sit in despair for too long. You're the type of person to do. But you're in social work. And that's all, I mean, you see a lot of different things. So you have your immediate work that you do. You mentioned your personal life. You have your personal life, which is not always perfect. And then you see what's happening in the world, the war, the genocide. You see all these things. How do you make sense of all of this? In your micro and macro level, as all these things are happening at the same time, and I feel are kicking up a couple notches. You know, we're going through an election year. Media and just all of the things that are being said. How do you make sense of all this in your way of thinking?
Probably a little bit at a time, because it is hard to make sense of all of it. And it's not that I don't feel despair. I just can't sit in that place for too long. I think when I recognize that I'm sitting in a place of despair is when I know, that I need support, that I need connection, that I need to reach to the places and people and mountains, right, that give me a sense of grounding and give me a sense of hope and remind me that that there is more. And that looks like in my day-to-day, not sinking into despair looks like, frankly, spending some time with my plants and sometimes apologizing to them because I have not been watering them on a regular basis.
I was going to ask you, what do you say to your plants? Because you said you come from a family,
we talk to our
a
plants.
lineage to talk to your plants. What do you say to your plants?
Oh man, I gas them up. Like if I'm walking by and there's a new pup, I'm like, you did that. And sometimes they get a song, and when I'm repotting them, I'm singing the way that my grandma would do the same thing. It's like my grandma would be whistling at her birds, singing to her plants, like just giving them compliments, being like, ay, que bonita, and like, how beautiful, look at you. And
Wow.
So sometimes it looks like, it's literally those micro sort of moments of noticing my plants. Then my dog Luna comes over, sets her head on my lap, and I'm like, oh, okay. Right? It's like, but it really is about settling my nervous system. Like the things that settle my nervous system almost always have to do with nature. It's like, it's either my plants, it's either getting out, looking at the mountains, it's doing something tactile, I'm playing, I'm making tea, I'm spending time with somebody who I care about or somebody who makes me feel cozy. I think those places make me feel really hopeful, because if I can see that goodness happen in those small spaces, then I believe that that's happening in a lot of other spaces, and that I believe that it can be replicated and that it can be cultivated beyond that moment. And so it's just, it looks like that on a day-to-day basis. And then I also try to do, what is it called? Adrienne Marie Brown calls it liberation. What does she call it? Shoot. I'll come back to that. Attention liberation? No. Something like that. I'll send you the what the term was.
Please.
But what they refer to is like choosing to also focus on the good things that are happening. Is I could totally just lean into the crappy things that are happening, but then I look at the beautiful things and the resistance movements and the way that young people are pushing us to think about things in a different way, and about the people who are, putting their bodies on the line to push for change that feels important to them. And those kind of things really help me to feel hopeful. It's because I'm like, okay, like look at all of these really important transformational things that are happening in these smaller spaces or in these broader ways. And that helps me feel like, that kicks me out of despair immediately, because I just sit in awe. I'm like, wow, that's just amazing. And I really think that young people are pushing us to, and I mean, I think young and old, right? But I think I'm especially inspired by young people who are continuously just shifting things.
Yeah.
And
they're normalizing mental health. I mean, think about it. I mean, mental health wasn't a topic of discussion growing up in our brown families.
No.
Like, there's just no way.
You just needed prayer, honey.
You just need prayer, or just buck up.
Or like that is so small
eat
compared
some
to everyone.
vegetables.
Yeah.
Eat some
You have
vegetables.
worries? Let me give you this broom.
Yeah.
You need something else to do? Let me give you clean.
Yeah, clean.
Oh, okay.
Clean. My family came from, we do like superstition. So it's like, if there's something going on, then that means that someone must have, put some sort of evil eye on you or whatever it is. So then we will clean it off, and then you brush yourself up, and then you go. That's as far as like mystic it went in healing, but it was nothing. It wasn't as deep as even when we talk about mental health now, and in the past 5 years, even how we've talked about it. And I do believe that comes from our youth.
Yeah.
And that they've normalized it. And then also people like you who are in the work, who are doing it, who are talking about it openly as well. Just this combination has been beautiful. And I really appreciate you offering that level of presence when all of this stuff is happening in our world, because I do believe that it's tough. I feel even my just even my mom and her parents, they've said that this is the we call it Kalyug, which is in Hinduism, it's like this time of real despair, darkness. And they've never, even though they've gone through war and colonization and displacement, they've never seen it quite like this. Yeah. That's what they're saying to me. And I'm just like, what? Is it that bad? And so when you're offering, talk to the plants and really, ground yourself and be connected to your family or your community. Little things, micro things that you do, that is so valuable in where we're at today. So I really appreciate you. I appreciate you sharing everything. Every word you said was beautiful.
Oh,
so thank you.
You're so sweet. Thank you for
so
having
much.
me. I'm just sitting here just blah, 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 blah.
It's beautiful. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah.